Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us for today's AOP Live session, Business Resilience for Short-Term Agility and Long-Term Growth. My name is Kelly Barner. I'm the Head of Content and Operations at Art of Procurement, and I'm joined today by my partner, Philip Ideson. Philip, how are you today?
Hey, Kelly, I'm good. Thank you very much. How are you?
I am doing well. I'm actually looking forward to this. This is a little bit of a role reversal.
Mm-hmm.
Usually I'm voice of the audience and you're leading the discussion, but I'll be the one sitting in that chair today, which is something that we always like to bring up at the beginning of these sessions. AOP Live formats, if you've never attended one before, this is not your typical webinar. What you will not see are slides. What you will not hear is one person talking for the next 45 or 50 minutes. Instead, this is an opportunity for you to participate in the discussion. So what we're going to do is we have a series of questions that came in during the registration process. So thank you to everyone who has already submitted questions. And we'll be soliciting thoughts, comments, and questions from you as we go through the live session. Now, that's what Phil is going to focus on today. So Phil will be watching. There is a chat box, if you happen to be with us live, right down below this broadcast screen. At any point, you're more than welcome to type in your questions and comments for today's guests. And so we look forward to the active role you're going to play in today's session.
Yeah, and so I was going to jump in, Kelly. I guess one of the interesting things with this role reversal is knowing my cue and my prompt. But I just wanted to say that if you'll see me, I may be typing, I may be looking away. It's because I'm really interacting with everybody in the audience. So please do keep those questions coming in. I'm going to jump into the conversation a couple of times as appropriate, but I look forward to seeing everyone's questions and comments throughout the session.
Absolutely. Now, before we bring our guests on stage, and we do actually have two excellent guests with us today, I wanted to share just a little bit about the topic and about them before you get a chance to hear from them directly. So certainly discussions of resilience and agility in procurement and supply chain are not new. But what we're going to be exploring today is how to look at short-term resilience and agility when you put it against the goal of long-term growth. It creates a much bigger picture challenge. So when a company's long-term vision is put up against the actions that all of us need to be carrying out in order to succeed in the short term, procurement's role actually starts to change. And so to discuss that with us, we have two guests. We're going to be joined in just a moment by Yatin Anand, who's a principal and procurement leader at KPMG, and also MVK, Chief Procurement Officer at Coupa, who happened to make a little bit of news of their own today, didn't they, Phil?
Yeah, so Coupa closed their acquisition by Thoma Bravo this morning. So I want to congratulate all at Coupa for on that occasion. I wanted to just give a little bit of a shout out before we get started.
Absolutely. Perfect example of real-term growth, long-term growth. So without further ado, why don't we go ahead and welcome in Yatin Anand and MVK. Hi, MVK and Yatin. Thank you both so much for being with us for today's AOP Live session.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So to get started, Phil a long time ago developed a question that we've had the opportunity to ask hundreds of procurement practitioners and executives. And so I want to warm up today by actually putting that question to both of you. MVK, I'll start with you. Did you find procurement or did procurement find you?
Yeah, so I'm a recovering finance, person, if you will. I started off in accounting, and I really at Foot Locker, when I was the European controller, I got excited about the power of data and how to make better business decisions, drive competitive pressure and fact-based decisions and stuff like that, and then implemented e-sourcing. And that's really when, procurement is just a really big deal. And so procurement, I think I found procurement.
And it actually sounds as though we might be having some issues with your audio, MVK. So check the settings for us. If you need to, pop out of the stream and just pop right back in with that link. While he does that, Yatin, why don't I put the same question to you? Did you find procurement or did procurement find you?
Sure, Kelly. I mean, I'm an engineer by trade, and being an electrical engineer and kind of going through kind of that background, one of my first pieces was, well, I knew that I did not want to be an electrical engineer for the rest of my life. So as I kind of maneuvered my way through my career, I started out very broad. I was a broad kind of supply chain professional focused on all facets of the supply chain, and just stumbled upon procurement and loved it. This is early stages of my career when I was in industry, in retail, at a retailer called Winn-Dixie Stores. That's where I stumbled upon procurement, loved it as a career, and have practiced it for the last 20 years. So I would say we found each other, and I'm loving every minute of it.
So we've got recovering, as MVK said, professionals from two different backgrounds, finance and engineering. So we'll have to see if there's some opportunities to maybe bring those touch points into the discussion today. And it looks like, let me just check, looks like we have MVK back. Let's see if we can bring him back on screen. There we go. Hi, MVK, yes. Welcome back.
Yes, thank you. So sorry, I actually set up, I found procurement at my time at Foot Locker, so forgive me for my technical difficulty.
No, well, the good news is, like you're a recovering finance professional, Yatin just shared that he's a recovering electrical engineer. So potentially after today, he can take a look at your electrical setup there. Everything we do these days is digital, which puts an element of surprise into everything.
For sure.
Absolutely. So to kick off today's discussion, one of the things that we're going to bring in, we like to run pulse polls and snap polls on LinkedIn right before we open these discussions. We talk about bringing in the voice of the audience and asking people questions during these sessions, but we get input in advance as well. And so here is a question that we had posed. And what I'll do is I'll actually read all of this into the conversation, because I do know that later on, or potentially even today, we'll have some people that are listening more than watching. But we had asked, which of the following short-term issues do you find most disruptive? And here are the results. So we have at 40%, actually just going to enlarge my screen here a little bit. At 40%, we have supply availability. No surprise after the last few years. 26%, we have supplier price increases. At 20% in third place, we have sudden changes in business strategy. And finally, with 14%, we have talent shortages. So Phil, I know that you're watching the discussion going on among the attendees, but I also want to give you an opportunity to comment on this. Any thoughts or observations based on these results and how they align with today's conversation?
So it's definitely interesting how talent shortages is the bottom of that list, given the fact that we were talking about talent shortages an awful lot last year. In fact, the last couple of years. And that's not to say that they're not important, but I think it's important to frame and contextualize this around short-term issues rather than long-term issues. I know we're going to talk about both short and long-term later in the conversation. Yeah. The supplier availability being top is, maybe it's not a surprise, but I think that's probably lessening for most organizations. I'd love, as we go into the conversations, to hear MVK and Yatin's view of that, whether, that a year ago would have been a far higher number and that supply availability issue is moderating, or whether, we're still seeing that across a lot of organizations being an issue.
Mm-hmm. So let me actually pull you in then. Yatin, when you take a look at these results, what completely confirms your perspective? What surprises you? Any initial thoughts that come to mind?
Yeah, no, I'm with Phil. I'm a bit surprised at how low that 14% on talent shortages is, right? And I think that likely has something to do with the current upheaval that we're in. And when all this news about hiring freezes, layoffs, that's probably what's driving this perception of, I think we probably have we have enough talent. I think the reality here is, as we climb our way out of the current market uncertainty, companies will still be challenged to find the right talent to enable their long-term vision. So I do expect, if we were to do this over again and do this poll survey in a year, I think that talent story will come back to what I would call kind of more normal levels. I guess that's my initial gut reaction to that. I think the second one I'd focus on is the price increases. While the market is starting to stabilize, the last 2 years have had a fairly direct impact to the bottom line, right? I mean, supply chain professionals, procurement professionals are being challenged with trying to take that cost back out. So where those costs crept up, we're now focused on looking at supply price increases and that cost. And so not surprised that that's in the mix, and that confirms a lot of what we're seeing in terms of demand from organizations today as well.
Yeah. And MVK, as I bring you in to get your general thoughts about these results, let me also sort of tack on and ask you an additional follow-up question. How risk averse do you think procurement is today versus where we are 3 years ago, 5 years ago, sort of looking at it as a trend? What are your thoughts around these short-term disruptions and how they're affecting the procurement psyche?
Yeah, I mean, the one that I agree with what was just said, so let's not echo that. But I think the one that I'm missing is, the cost of capital. I mean, obviously, interest rates are continuously going up, especially as inflation doesn't seem to come down, even with demand is starting to soften globally. So I think supply availability, to me, I think it's going to straighten itself out very quickly, very soon. You can already see it with earnings releases from big retailers. Shipping costs, container cost, I always said, is an early gauge of economic reality, and all of that has come down dramatically. So I think that's all going to balance itself out. I'd say cost of capital for me would be a big one, especially if you've been financing your strategy by external capital. Is a big one for me. I think if you think about risk, I think we've all learned a lot over the past 24 months. But I think we've also learned that we can come through whatever is ahead, as long as we break down the silos between, supply chain, procurement, finance, the business. We really collaborate together. So I think we've developed a muscle that I didn't necessarily think we had, and I think we're only starting to really flex that. So I think from a risk perspective, I think we realize we need much more agility in our supply chain. I think that's what a lot of companies have built. I think we look at supply chain very, very differently today as we did 24 months ago. So I'm actually quite optimistic, knowing that the recession is either we're in it, we are just not admitting it, or we're about to enter one. But I feel pretty strong and pretty confident about what's coming next, and I think procurement is right at the center of it.
Well, and MVK, let's stay there. So clearly you're leaning on your finance background, which is fascinating given the role that procurement is playing in organizations today. And you mentioned the R word, recession. Whether it's, I read an article the other day that said it's been put on hold or it's been delayed or something like that. I think everybody's cautiously optimistic that it will either not be as bad as initially feared, or maybe it actually will never be officially declared. But how do you feel like that lingering possibility of an official recession is coming into executive level thinking and impacting procurement's priorities?
Yeah, I think we always say we hope for the best and embrace and plan for the worst. I think that's what a finance person does. So I still have that in my brain. I think that a recession is inevitable. I think governments have just the free money and the cost of capital, et cetera, over the past 24 months wasn't where it should have been. It's easy to say that hindsight, right? But I think we have to go through some pain. And I think we're going to experience that over the next, 12, 18 months. I think what we can do as procurement is just to focus on what you can control, which is your own four walls, your relationship with your suppliers, understand what goes on with your suppliers, understand their finance structure. Are they reliant on external capital? If they are, let's talk about that. Optionality, building optionality in your supply chain. I highly encourage every practitioner out there to think about what if scenarios, run a digital twin of your supply chain, whether you do that digitally or in an Excel spreadsheet, as I used to before the technology was there. But just brace yourself, hope for the best. We're all positive thinkers, at least I know I am. But I think we should plan for some pretty painful times where top line growth is just not as easy as maybe it was in the years past, and that's fine. We still need to run the business, and let's just step up and lead from the front. That's what I would say.
Well, and it's interesting because, as you had said, we plan for the worst, we hope for the best. This is constantly changing. It's like the tides. And I was actually talking to somebody the other day that talked about the perspective of CEOs as being like a weather vane, right? It's not necessarily fixated at one point. It's to some extent affected by all of those external pressures, the competitive landscape, board set priorities. Yatin, if we think about not only procurement wanting to be agile, but also remaining aligned with the objectives of the overall business as they shift, even if they're in small ways, how can procurement teams ensure, whether through testing or conversations or listening, to make sure that their priorities and their actions do in fact stay aligned in as real time as possible with what the business as a whole is trying to achieve?
Yeah, and I mean, agility is important in today's environment. There's no questions about it, right? But that said, what we are seeing is employees today get frustrated with this start, stop, continue messaging, right? I mean, if you're just putting out fires and if you're constantly just reacting kind of to the next fire and don't have kind of the longer term vision, that's where this becomes immensely challenging to keep your workforce focused on those goals. And kind of be ready for what's next. So it is crucial to have a clear long-term vision and to ensure that the shorter-term milestones along the way are in support of that vision. I mean, I'll take a company that we're consulting with today. Sure. They've clearly laid out their 5 to 10-year roadmap. They've got a vision, right? Now, along the way, it's going to take different paths based on what the market dictates and what some of the shorter-term hurdles are that they're going to cross. And as those short-term priorities pop up, what they're doing really well is they're assessing it against that roadmap. They're assessing it and saying, how does this fit within the longer-term vision? They put in place like a transformation governance model. And essentially, for every short-term initiative that pops up, they're looking at, where does this fit in the broader picture? Yeah. What's the ROI associated with it? That's how they're determining priority and sequence and being very, very deliberate about where to invest their money. And then additionally, there's consistent communication and feedback, right? I mean, people like to be in the know. And so having that feedback loop to all of the stakeholders, making sure everyone is on the same page is what then takes away the frustration that comes with that start, stop, continue. So I would say, I think that's a little bit of what I've seen with one of my clients that seems to be doing well and reacting to, as MBK said, the parameters that we can control in this uncertain environment.
Yeah. And you mentioned governance. And so it seems like a good opportunity to bring up maybe the elephant in the room from procurement standpoint. We've talked about all of these different short-term challenges. Are you seeing any evidence that dealing with these short-term challenges effectively is altering the way that companies are approaching their longer-term ESG visions? Are you seeing any indication that there's an impact there?
MBK, you want to go? Go ahead.
Yeah, I can. I mean, what I see in our community, at least, is, I mean, it is still it's still in the top 10. But I think if you look at what was a priority for 2021, 2022 versus today, it has dropped from maybe in the top 4 to in the top 8. It's still a critical element. It's still your investors expect it, your customers expect it. Our customers at Coupa are asking for Coupa's own environmental and social governance stance and our diversity spend and our code of conduct. And it's still a critical element of doing business. I just do believe that there are a couple things that we're a little bit more worried about, such as business continuity, raw material shortages, inflationary pressure, and some of the things, digitization. And I think they have moved up to maybe the top 4 or 5. It's still in the top 10, but it's not in the top 4. I don't know, Yatin, if that's what you're saying.
Yeah, no, I think that's very consistent, MBK, right? I mean, much like the digital transformation agenda, and that train hasn't slowed down, we have not seen clients completely deprioritize or ditch their ESG strategy. I mean, in fact, the two are quite interconnected, right? If you think about digital transformation and ESG, clients, I mean, like we've got a client who is currently assessing the replacement of 3 or 4 of their legacy procurement and supply chain technologies. As we're going through that evaluation, I mean, ESG is fairly front and center in that criteria. They are taking the opportunity as they're going through the digital transformation journey to build in the ESG use cases, the ESG requirements. They want to make sure that when they come out of this on the other side, and when they transform digitally, they are meeting those ESG reporting requirements. So I completely concur with MBK, right? It may have been a top 3, top 4 issue. It may have fallen down, somewhat industry oriented in that sense, but certainly not something that clients are deprioritizing.
And I maybe, if I just want to add a little bit real quick, I mean, going through, like, there's always 3 things that you can do during a time of high uncertainty. I've said this before in another session, but you can freeze, you can just wait, and you can flight, you can run for the hills, or you can fight. And what fighting means is, to me, is make the right investments in the right areas that ultimately either give you competitive edge or drive the highest amount of ROI. That sounds pretty straightforward. It's not always easy, but in a situation like this, the companies there's lots of great studies out there from the last big disruption in 2007 and 8, if you will, that the companies that during that time made the right investments in the right people, the right process, and the right technology, those are the ones that ultimately outperform the ones that haven't. And I just wanted to make that point. And the same applies for ESG as it applies to investments. This is not the time to stop investing in your business. This is the time to maybe recalibrate and look at the investments that are going to drive competitive edge.
Well, and to your point, I think we may think of ourselves as making short-term decisions and choices today, but in the big picture, all of those things do add up to become the long-term trajectory that we're on. So before we switch paths and start actually focusing on some of these longer-term strategies, Phil, let me bring you in and get both your personal perspective on what we've discussed so far, as well as any interesting questions that you've seen come in from the audience.
Yeah, thanks, Kelly. And I've written a bunch of notes as well as we've been having this initial conversation. I do want to give a shout out to Tim, who asked a very similar question on ESG and the importance of ESG, just as you were asking that question as well. So I wanted to just quickly reference that. Now, the conversation that we were just having then around priorities, investment priorities, oftentimes procurement has been, we kind of post that, the stakeholder has made a case for investment to buy something, has got the okay to buy it, and then comes to us to help them, go and acquire ultimately the services that relate to that business case. I'm going to ask this to both of you, but MBK, I'll start with this first. We'll start with you first. Does this give procurement another value lever to pull to position themselves to actually help in that business case development pre any investment decisions being made by a CEO?
Yeah, I'd say, the first advice I can always give anyone to think that is thinking about any kind of journey is that, we should own this conversation. In other words, don't make the mistake that IT, and I hope there's IT people on this phone call, or finance people should start to determine what solution procurement needs. We should lead this, and procurement should, it's like the mechanic buying their own car, or the neighbor. I say I decide the car, and it should be me to drive this change. I've done this in my past. I was the one accountable. I wanted to be responsible, but I also wanted to have the D of decision, of course, collaboratively with your cross-functional partners. So that's one thing I always want to emphasize, how important that is, because otherwise you'll end up with something that you don't want. So that's one. And then for us, it's to clearly articulate why it matters. Why is it important that you make investments in procurement? Forget about technology. I recognize the company I work for, but let's just talk about investment in procurement and why is it important. And if we are unable to talk about this in a very, elevator pitch kind of way, 30 seconds with your CEO in the elevator down, why he or she should invest in procurement. If we can't do that, then you're never going to get it. Whether it's more people, whether it's operationalization, and I know, Yatin, you'll have great perspective, of course, as well, or whether it's about getting the right technology that ultimately is going to allow you to drive real measurable value. I think we often do ourselves a disservice by letting others determine our own destiny.
Mm-hmm. And I'll build on that, MBK. Completely agree with you, right? I think with what's happened recently and the disruption, in fact, I think procurement leaders have a wonderful opportunity, if they don't have that seat on the table, to establish that position I mean, with the inflationary pressures, what's happening with the regulatory requirements, where pricing is, and kind of all of the cost and pricing pressures that we have, with what's happening from an industry landscape, from an M&A standpoint. I mean, these are all key forces compelling procurement leaders to reevaluate their strategies. It is time for procurement leaders to be the disruptors, bring the function to life, right? Work across all of the silos, and essentially shift that reputation of all I'm looking at is transactions or cost cutting to something that's a little bit more customer centric and business enabling. And to MVK's point, presenting this to your CEOs and your CFOs, presenting that procurement value proposition, I mean, that's the role. And explaining what's our role in navigating this change, navigating all of this disruption. That's how we establish our place at that table and influence the long-term strategy for the company.
Yeah, and those are the ones in our community that are the ones that I grab. That we have a lot of great companies. We got more than 3,000 customers, but great companies. But those are the ones that are also able to articulate that it's not just about taking out costs. It's about better quality, lead time, de-risk your supply chain, innovation, business continuity, like all those things that you can't really quantify as to pennies and cents and dollars. Those are the companies that get that investment into people, into process, into technology. I mean, I couldn't agree more, Yatin. Well said.
So there's a question that I'm going to bring up on screen here, which is actually really interesting based on MVK, what you said around cost of capital and that being a driver. So the question is, how much pressure would cost of capital, or do we believe cost of capital would actually have on pricing? And perhaps I'll expand that to say, are there any specific areas where it might have a bigger impact than others? So MVK, as you raised that, I'll post that to you first, and then Yatin, please feel free to jump in.
Yeah, I think it depends on what it is that you're buying. If what you're buying, I mean, I think the answer is quite self-explanatory. But if whatever you're buying relies on investment, in other words, machinery, things that are locked into your cash is locked into something for a longer period of time, then absolutely it will have an impact in price. If it's not, then I don't think so. I think if all you're buying is finished goods, and it's in an inventory, and you're able to really churn your inventory very, very quickly, then I think you might actually have a competitive edge. I think what's more important is maybe not so much cost of capital, but it's more your working capital. Is how much money do you need, and where does that money come from, and what's the price of that money, which of course is interest. I think that's going to determine the pricing of your company and ultimately your competitive edge. That's how I'd like to. I don't know, Yatin, how you think about it.
No, I completely concur with that, right? I mean, I think, and here's what we're seeing with companies, right? When it comes to capital spending in particular, I think companies have gotten a lot more deliberate about where that money is going and what's the net outcome. Going back to MVK's point, right? It depends on what you're buying. It certainly depends on how capital intensive the purchase is. But what I'm seeing a lot of CFOs and CPOs partake in now is, when it comes to capital spending, let's be a lot more deliberate about our decision making and where we are putting our money, and how does that line up with our longer term goal. In some cases, it might be capital intensive, but it will still make sense because you're going to come out on top and you're going to come out ahead of your competition. And so long as everybody's aligned with that message, clients and companies are placing that back.
Well, we certainly never short of questions. I have other questions to pose, but I'm also cognizant of the time. So if time allows, towards the end, I'll come back with a couple of other things that I was going to ask based on the first conversation, but that may be a good segue into talking more long term. So with that, Kelly, I'll hand it back to you.
Excellent. Thank you. And as a matter of fact, it brings to mind for me one of the things that is both so core to procurement's value and also provides the connectivity between the short term and the long term, and that's data. When it comes to the company making either shorter term reactive decisions or planning out their vision for the future, procurement's data and insight, especially around markets, can be so incredibly critical. Yatin, if I start with you, is there more that we can be doing today to leverage the data that we have, and then even to strengthen that data so that it advises us better as we try to provide recommendations to the organization as they make longer term plans?
Yeah, no questions asked, right? I mean, there's always more we could be doing in the data domain, and I see clients and companies have a continued focus and emphasis on this, right? I mean, if I put the procurement hat on, from a procurement lens, most companies have the basic foundational data in place around spend and classification by suppliers, categories. When companies are faced with fires, though, or we deal with some of the disruption that we've dealt with, the key is to have that data available at your fingertips and for there to be a high degree of reliability on the accuracy of that data. The organization is to believe that the data is accurate and not question. Kind of a lot of what we see is, well, we're not sure if this is the right data. Let's go to our suppliers to get that data. I think we, in a time like this, that issue gets magnified and that issue gets amplified, right? Some of the data domains that we're seeing a lot more emphasis on over the last couple of years, I would say contracts. In the procurement realm, contracts are rich with information. And with technology where it is today, I mean, almost every facet of a contract is mineable and should be available at the tips of a procurement and a finance professional. Reliance on external market data, right? How do you enrich your data with all of this external market data, whether it be ESG or all of the other streams that exist? That's become a very powerful avenue to plan for, to predict to some degree, some of the disruption that may come in your supply chain. And the third domain for me is supply performance. How do you holistically measure supply performance, including risk? What does that story look like? That goes a long way in building those strategic supplier relationships and moving from that transactional, let's negotiate price relationship to let's innovate together and let's drive cost out in that fashion type conversation. So that's kind of my view on data. MBK, anything you'd add?
Yeah, no, I'd say, I mean, well said. I always said, like, spend analytics in itself is kind of meaningless because it's spend that has incurred and it's rear view mirror. What I like is what Yatin was talking about is predictive analytics. Like, how can I, ideally in a larger data set, such as a community, how can I leverage the power of a community, and how can that community help me make better business decisions? I think that's where it's going. It's no different than how you do this in your own private life when you go to a restaurant or you get in a car and you go from A to B to C to D and back to A. I want the technology to tell me what's the path of least resistance, what is the best restaurant, how reliable is that rating, right? I mean, Yelp or whatever you use. But my point is, I want the business world to operate exactly the same as my private life is, which is I'll let the technology help me where it makes sense. Obviously, I still have human interaction. It's, AI is interesting. RPMA is very interesting, but we still need human brain. And I still believe we need human capital. But that's where I think the data should be. If you don't have data at your fingertips today, you're going to die. Not literally, but figuratively. But you know what I mean? Like, I mean, but I really want data to be part of a much bigger pool and let that be prescriptive and tell me what I should be focusing on and give me alerts. I mean, that's really what I think data should be doing.
Right. But to pick up on your point about the human element, the other thing that's incredibly important, both in the short term and the long, are the strength of our supplier relationships. Because in both cases, if we find ourselves in a bad short-term situation, it's most likely our suppliers that we're turning to and saying, can you help us through this? But we don't want to do that so many times that we burn a bridge and can't maintain a longer-term partnership with them. MVK, any thoughts about how we can lean on our suppliers as we need them in the short term without damaging the potential value orientation of those relationships in the longer term?
Yeah, we can only look at the car industry, how important it is to have excellent partnerships with your suppliers, right? That's exactly what happened with the chips. So, but I mean, that's an easy hindsight. But I think that you need to open up your books to your suppliers. No different than you should ask your suppliers to do the same with you. I've always believed, years ago when I started in procurement, that it's not just about getting a great price and beating a supplier on the head until they cave. I mean, that's really the 90s and maybe even before. It is opening up to your suppliers. It's explaining to them where you struggle. Be really transparent about what it is that you're after. What are my objectives? Where am I going 3 years out, 5 years out? What matters to me? Is it cost of capital? Is it pricing? Is it quality? Is it lead time? Is it reliability? Is it competitive edge? Whatever are the value drivers for my company. But in exchange, you also should almost demand from your suppliers to do the same. And the relationships I've had in my life with suppliers that I still have today, that have been the most meaningful, are the ones that have been the most transparent and not transactional, getting an RFP done. I'm not a big fan of RFPs to begin with, to be honest, but that's a different conversation. I mean, so I'd say open up the books, be clear and transparent what your goals are, and ask for something in return from your suppliers.
Yeah. And this actually comes back to what you were saying in some ways around contracts and being able to mine them for information, but also maybe changing how we think about them. MVK is talking about working with suppliers and what's the difference between a shorter term, more transactional supplier relationship and something that truly does rise to the level of partnership. It actually calls to mind for me, even something as simple as dating, right? Very few people are in the dating world and are at a romantic dinner and say, tell me, how are you with plumbing and basic home electrical, right? But over the longer term, those kinds of things that you don't tend to make decisions about in the short term are important. So if we're running a sourcing project, even if it's initially just for 2 years or 3 years, a relatively contained frame of time, how do we need to change both the way we think about which suppliers to choose and then also what we build into the contracts to reinforce that?
Yeah, and I think it's a good point, right? And as MVK was talking, I mean, the term that keeps kind of going through my head is, the term customer of choice now has a whole new meaning.
Oh, yeah.
Right. I mean, and procurement professionals should be, if they're not, focused on establishing that status with at least their key tier 1 suppliers. I mean, as much as, the days of, hey, procurement beating up a supplier, etc. I think what this disruption has taught us is you need to be on the top of the list for your suppliers as well. Again, I'll take case in point. What happened in the logistics space for a number of clients that we've consulted with in the last couple of years. I mean, folks that were more transactionally oriented and were going with the lowest price first carrier and kind of spreading out the demand across this carrier base got deprioritized. Carrier said, I have a limited number of drivers. I'm short on supply. I'm going to prioritize relationships. I'm going to prioritize where I have predictability of demand. And they went that route. And so now we're seeing kind of a full turnaround. Well, how do I become a customer of choice for this carrier? So tying it back to sourcing and tying it back to as companies are evaluating that, I think those facets and parameters become important. Broadening the horizon of what else can you do? Where are you innovating from a technology standpoint? How do your technology seamlessly marry with ours? Are all part of that evolution with the supplier. So if you're kind of investing in a tier 1 supplier relationship, let's ensure that you've invested the time and the effort in understanding those facets through your RFP journey, or if we're not doing an RFP ideally, because it's not to MVK's taste, we're kind of going through that process and ensuring that diligence is done upfront.
Yeah. No, I want to actually pause here for a minute. And Phil, I want to bring you back in for a couple of things. Certainly, I know I can see that we have additional questions coming in, but MVK brought up the specific supplier partnerships that exist within automotive and how important those are. And I know that that's a huge part of your practitioner background.
Yeah.
Can I ask you to just kind of comment on that for a minute? Because I think the automotive industry is incredibly interesting in terms of how those relationships work.
Yeah, the automotive is a fascinating industry. It's a fascinating industry because the importance of procurement is probably no higher in any other industry than it is in automotive, because the margins within automotive. As a result, there's a lot of investment in tools and in people and, maybe to a lesser extent in technology in the automotive space. However, in a lot of times those can be misused, or the procurement strategies can be misused, where you end up having win-lose relationships, zero-sum games, sometimes questionable ethics to get your, the pricing that you want. And of course, you see in the automotive world, those that are actually have invested a lot in supplier relationships are the ones in times of trouble that actually you're the customer of choice. there's a huge benefit to those. And for so long, the automotive kind of companies looked and said, hey, I'm one of 5 or one of 6. So if you mess with me, then you're suddenly taking out 20% of your potential customer base. So it's fascinating to see how that's changed. And some of those older practices, I think, that we referred to kind of come from those days. So that's definitely inspired me on my journey to look and say, like, how can you take the best practices from environments like that, but leave behind some of the practices that weren't necessarily very collaborative from a supplier relationship. But I actually because I wanted to jump in actually on the conversation, because we talked about customer of choice. But one of the things I think about over the last couple of years is there may be supplier relationships where we believe we have that relationship, but then that supplier comes in and says, hey, I'm increasing my prices 20% and, no negotiation. Or I'm going to put you on a spot buy now. This contract, force majeure, sorry about that. I know you thought we had a good relationship, but I got all the leverage here, and they changed that. Like, I'd love to know from Yatin, from your perspective, but also MVK, like, how, if a procurement person is in that situation, how do you respond to that where you thought you had a great relationship and perhaps you didn't?
Yeah, I mean, I think a large part does come back to, we touched on the data and analytics thread, right? Mm-hmm. A lot of times when we are surprised, we're surprised because we don't have all the facts. Mm-hmm. We don't have all the information. What does your contract look like? Are you aware of what you put into that contract? It was truly a strategic relationship. You shouldn't be put in that position to begin with. But that said, I mean, I think if we are faced with that situation, I think in my view, like all good procurement professionals, we are good at kind of introducing competition and creating kind of leverage for our companies, using all of the tools that we have at our disposal to start to create kind of, that model where we can start to introduce some of that competitive pressure. But I think, to me, really, surprises come when you're not well informed, and when you don't have the sound data analytics technology at your disposal. Otherwise, I think you're generally prepared for the worst, right? Again, putting that finance mentality on, you should always be prepared for that, right? You should always have a plan B and a backup plan when it comes to supplier relationships. But those are some quick thoughts. MVK, I'm sure you have something to add to that.
No, I couldn't agree more. I think the biggest difference between the dating, what the analogy you use, Kelly, is, you probably wouldn't be dating someone else, but at the same time, I think that would be frowned upon. But everything else makes total sense, right? You always want to have a backup plan. As a practitioner, yes, we can have strategic partnerships, but it doesn't mean that I'm not going to continue to have competitive pressure, which is probably also what you do in the dating game, right? I mean, you still want to have, something to desire. And I think that that's no different than doing business. Like I can have a really strong, deep partnership with a supplier, but I would probably not want to be single sourced, for example. Right. And there should always be something to gain. And as long as you do your homework, you have the facts, you understand your commodities, you have category plans, you understand the dynamics in the market, I don't necessarily think that it'll happen. And if it does, then of course there is time for you to show how agile and resilient you are.
And there's probably a couple of themes there. One is what we talked about, that ability to be predictive and be proactive related to that. But also, as you said earlier, MVK, optionality. And it's funny, as we kind of went on this path 10 years ago of we need to consolidate all of our suppliers, we need to have as low a tail as possible, let's put all our eggs in these baskets, and then you end up having no optionality. Optionality is definitely something that we push a lot with Art of Procurement from a risk perspective. We did have a question from Charles that I want to bring up just before I come back to you, Kelly. Let me bring this up on screen. And MVK, I'll pose this to you first. Maybe it's an unanswerable question, I'm not sure, but I'm interested in perspectives. How should we ensure that the quality of data is adequate? Is there a baseline for data quality?
Well, I mean, it sounds simple, but it's garbage in, garbage out. So if you don't understand what goes into whatever data lake you have, or Excel spreadsheet, if you're still very basic, and you don't have some sort of taxonomy to classify your data, and it's garbage in, garbage out. So I'd say start with the source.
Mm-hmm.
How reliable is the source? Don't rely on your ERP. I mean, the ERP is not going to give you what you need to manage your business. That's reporting, it's accounting, but it's not spend. But I'd say start with the source of your data. I'm happy to go a little deeper, Charles, if you want. Look me up, mvk@coupa.com. I'm happy to help. But to me, it's garbage in, garbage out.
Yeah, and I think for me, I would say the slightly different angle to this, right? The real stick measure is whether your business stakeholders believe that data, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you can stake claim that my data is 99.5% accurate, I know it's almost impossible to get there, and your business believes in it, that goes a long way in establishing your stick measure for data quality. Because a large part of what procurement does is interacting with those business stakeholders, and when the challenge comes on data, it generally comes from those same business stakeholders.
And the first time you show up with a stakeholder and show them data that they don't trust, then it does a lot of damage to your relationship, which in some cases is really hard to come back from as a procurement professional.
Exactly.
Yeah.
All right, Kelly, I'm going to hand back to you.
Sure. And actually, that provides me with a great transition. I was trying to think about how do we pull all of this short-term responsiveness with long-term growth orientation together. And one of the phrases that comes to mind is the expression that culture eats strategy for breakfast. And so when we talk about trusting data, when we talk about trusting procurement, in some ways, what we're actually talking about is the culture that is built by procurement leaders and which exists within the team as a whole. So Yatin, starting with you, how can today's CPOs, how can aspiring CPOs work towards creating and contributing to a culture that provides the team with the strength and agility and creativity they need in the short term, but also the vision and the planning and the ideation that they need in order to contribute to competitive advantage longer term? How would you sort of pull that all together? And then MVK, I'll ask you the same question.
Yeah, I mean, I think from a culture standpoint, again, I mean, talent is at the core of culture, in my opinion. I mean, procurement, like most other functions, is dealing with workforce challenges, right? And the needs are different. The younger workforce that is replacing the institutional knowledge of the retirees is focused on employee experience. With what's happening in the digital transformation space, you're eliminating or looking to eliminate a lot of the tactical work. There's a stronger need, particularly post-pandemic, for global collaboration internally within the organization as well as externally within the supply base. I think as companies look to influence culture and talent, they need to ensure that the work is being matched up with the right talent. Let's leverage contingent labor where it's warranted. Let's invest in digital talent, which is key, right? I mean, you're going and making all of these deep digital investments. Do you have the talent to then carry it forward? Outsourcing is another great play that we're kind of starting to see. So aligning the talent with the strategy largely has an impact on culture is kind of what I'm building towards. And then the last point I'll make there is, I mean, lead from the top. Definitely, right? If I think about CPOs, if I think about CFOs, if you are putting in this notion of, hey, we're in cost containment mode, or we're looking to be kind of more stringent about where we are spending our money, embody that, show that, do little examples of that, call in town halls where you can personify that a little bit for your individuals and make it real for them. Those are the two things that jump out at me. For me, talent and culture are quite intertwined, which is why I double down on talent. Yeah. And then leading from the top is another good way of doing that. MVK, I'll let you build on that.
Yeah, great point. I'd say real quick, so we have time for more questions. But the first thing is diversity in your team. I think we should really focus. If you look at my team, I've got high diversity, gender, but also backgrounds, culture, nationalities, and I think creating a really diverse team. I think I would highly encourage everyone to do that, and those are the teams that I also love connecting within the community as well. The second thing is just keep it simple. Have 2 or 3 things that you want to be famous for from a procurement perspective, and rally behind that. But don't make the mistake that one of them is that cost reduction, because I mean that's kind of so that's the second thing. And the third thing is I think we should ensure that we provide everyone with the right tools. the digital fluency and digital capabilities are just at the core. All these young, smart people that are entering the labor market that we want to attract and retain. Nobody wants to be stuck in Excel. Nobody wants to be stuck in an ERP. Nobody wants to be stuck in JD Edwards or some other ERP that you're having that might be really old legacy. So you're going to have to invest in the right tools. You have the right operating model, the right processes. So the foundation should be that, right? The right digital capabilities, the right operating model, the right diversity in your team, and then have 2 or 3 goals. That could be ESG. If you look at myself at Coupa, it's around ESG. It's about developing my team, and it's about getting to level 3 procurement, which is much closer to the business and much more collaboration. I mean, those are, I think, the 3 goals that I will have for 2023. My team is going to get behind that. We're going to put it on our intranet. Everybody knows how procurement at Coupa operates. It's not rocket science. And then we just need to execute against that. And I think if you do that, then I think procurement is the coolest profession in the world. I really believe that.
Oh, well, there's no debating that. Although I will say 1.2 debate, you talk about the importance of diversity of background. So even in today's conversation, we have electrical engineering, we have finance, we have automotive, and Phil, here's my real-time fact check, retail. Procurement in retail is every bit as important as procurement in automotive. So I'm gonna use my opportunity of being host today to call out and say, nope, retail is right up there with automotive in terms of importance, the margins, the supplier relationships. But I think we're able to have this conversation because of all of the different backgrounds and perspectives and learnings and experiences that we bring to this idea, both of short-term resilience and also of long-term growth. So with that said, I want to thank MVK and Yatin Anand. Thank you both for sharing your perspective, your point of view, and fielding live questions today. Thank you to everybody who submitted questions in advance, who joined us to watch or listen live, or who will watch or listen on demand later on. And Phil, thank you as well for moderating and checking in with the audience and joining the conversation.
Thank you.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for being here with us today. Do check out the Art of Procurement calendar for upcoming digital events. We have quite a few on there, and we look forward to seeing everybody at the next live virtual Art of Procurement event. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.